very much. As you'll have heard, everybody up here, possibly except for me, is a very experienced technical leader. But today we're not actually going to be talking tech. We are going to be talking about lean beyond the dev team. We've spent a lot of time today hearing about how agile is about customer centricity, and that it applies in product development, it applies in technology projects. Well, what can we learn as a publishing unit beyond that? And we're going to be kicked off today by Paul explaining how eLife have actually been experimenting with lean beyond the dev team.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Right, so first of all, I thought after Tasha spoke about what we're going to be talking about today, I thought it'd be easier to illustrate what we've been doing with pictures, and also give me a great opportunity to use a great pun about leaning outside the technology team, which is what we've been doing at eLife. So I'll not explain too much about eLife. You've heard about a lot of us before, just to know that we're a non-profit, mission-driven publisher and also technology provider to the industry. And our goal really is to try and improve every part of scholarly publishing. So this is where we started looking at our editorial workflow. So anyone know what this is? No? Good. Right, so this is a cumulative flow diagram. And this is something that we use inside the technology team. This is the one from last week, showing that we have 40 tasks in flight, and the three different colours, the brown, the yellow, and the orange, show the different states within the flow through our system. So think about our to-do list, our doing list, and our testing list of tasks on our Kanban board. You can think of the work flowing through the system. So when I first came to eLife, I was very struck by the fact that as soon as you walk in the door, you're actually within the editorial flow of a manuscript. So as you walk in, you've got the editorial team. You then move past the production team. You then move to the product team and look how articles are displayed. And you've got the technology team after that. So it's physical representation of the flow through the system. So I thought, oh, great, I know about flows. I can maybe help these people out. So early on, we were looking at the measurements within the editorial team, and I got them to produce a flow diagram too. So you can see this here is all the various states of a manuscript within the peer review and submission process. One of the big bits there is waiting for reviews, which is obviously going to be one of the longer times, but these other parts all add to this process, and what we want to do is try and minimize this so we get a quick turnaround so people can easily get on with doing more reviews from the editor's point of view, and also for the authors can get feedback quickly and we can get things published and scientists building on the stuff that we're publishing. So always something good to look at. So we started looking at the bottlenecks, and I started passing around one of my favorite books, and if you've not read it, The Goal by Elijah Goldratt is one of the great texts on theory of constraints and looking at how flows in organizations work. That's based on manufacturing, as is the genesis of and the pioneering things around lean that come from Toyota. So when people say, can you use this outside technology teams? Yes, you can, because that's where it started. And we've just adapted it and turned it into little software cards rather than pieces of car moving around, which is what Toyota have been doing. So what we did was to look at where the bottlenecks were, and then also try and look at a methodology to help us identify and slowly improve what we're doing in editorial. So we started using what's known as the Toyota Kata. Now, a kata is a set of repetitive movements. It comes from martial arts, and you'll probably recognize this 1984 classic, where Daniel here is trying to learn how to do karate from Mr. Miyagi, and he's constantly learning and redoing things over and over again. So the idea is you do one small known exercise, you do it over and over again and constantly keep improving. So looking at Toyota's goals from using their kata, what they wanted was no mistakes, 100% value added, automating their workflow with no bottlenecks, and having people engaged in it. So eLife adapted that to think about what we were trying to solve. So we wanted no complaints from authors, editors, or reviewers, 100% value added, papers flowing with no queues, and a highly motivated and engaged set of people in the process. So very similar. Yet another continuous improvement cycle. We've seen a few of these diagrams today, all different words, but again, plan, do, study, act. We what the Carter teacher used to do is to look at a target condition, something you want to try and achieve, and then do a small iteration on that, check the results, see what the difference was, and then make another small change and do that cycle again. So we looked at one small part from that, the bottleneck, one of the bottlenecks we identified, which was the fact that we had over 20% of our papers were failing the initial QC check. Now that's the sort of thing that means that authors are just not either reading the instructions or we're being too strict or things like that. So lots of small changes could be made. You can see that they've been listed down here. Should also point out, I keep saying we. I wasn't involved in any of this. I kind of seeded the idea. I got a facilitator in to help our team run this, and this is all down to the editorial team, to the fact that I've even stolen the slides from them as well. So thanks to them and not me. And looking at what they wanted to do was try and drop the percentage of papers that failed at initial QC, and the target condition was 1% of papers by the 1st of June, and this was started in beginning of May, I think. So they wrote it all down, pretty lo-fi on a whiteboard, kept it nice and visible, and then as they moved through, they had a Slack bot remind them to check what the current conditions were, what the target condition was, so they were constantly reminding themselves what the obstacles were, and see if there were any more changes that need to be done. They could then check the results again. So this Slack bot would remind them once a day to check all these things. So over the month or so, and they extended it right into the end of June, because they were getting quite good success for it. They just make small changes, and you can see a couple of the examples here. They tweaked the author guide. They changed the wording on the splash screens. They did things like relaxing the check. They retrained some of the staff in different ways to respond to authors. And this helped them reduce from over 22% failing to 4% failing by June 20th. So it really did work. And I think having those constant iterations meant they could see which things were moving and which things weren't. We tried before, we use a thing called OKRs at eLife, Objectives and Key Results. And what they do is help you align towards your mission. And they set as goals. And the key results there are usually measurable and timely, so you can get to those. But they span over a 3-month period. But what this does is give you small iterative steps in between those things, really looking at the lean principles of minimizing waste and maximizing the work not done. So everyone was only concentrating on stuff that made a difference, and then also measuring to see the results of that difference. And doing that on a much smaller iterative scale meant that they were able to get down to only 4% of things failing, really improving things, and then all contributing to eLife's mission, which actually is the first thing you see when you open the door and enter the building. So all helps us recognise and encourage those responsible behaviours that we're all about. So that's what we're doing. Okay.
So, thank you, Paul, which leads me very nicely onto our first question. So obviously, in the case of eLife, going lean has affected the organisation beyond the development team. I'm going to start with Sharon, because you're at the far end. Has that been true of BMJ as well?
I think yes, both by accident and by design. So as we brought in Agile 4 years ago, we started to see staff would take some elements of that and use that within their own teams. So you'll very regularly see staff stand-ups, especially if we're working through a project or there's a big piece of change going on. We'll see those teams coming together. But we also have made very deliberate changes using lean techniques. So as we outsourced and moved our customer services team out of London, the person we brought in to run that team was a lean practitioner. And with all of that change, she took huge amounts of time out of our customer service process, all focused on improving delivery. So we actually had less customer service calls coming in the first place. People were, their problems were solved faster. And she continues to iterate that process. 2 years in, we see, again, still massive changes in meeting targets there. And I also talk to our journals team, because I don't manage our journals platform. I think a lot of that was just focusing on removing anything that didn't add value. So I don't think they would call it lean, but that's what they've been doing, is every year trying to take out small, tiny steps. And some of the numbers they gave me, so time for first decision was reduced from 68% of submissions, manuscripts returned to the author, to 10% of manuscripts returned to the author, just by focusing on some of the changes. They also just decided that if they didn't hear from a reviewer within a week, they were going to move on to the next one, instead of sitting and waiting for somebody to reply. And just introducing some of those what were really common sense steps, they've actually significantly altered the process by which we work. but I don't think any of them would say the word lean.
Fair enough. Richard.
So I'll take the liberty to kind of slightly reinterpret the question, if I may, because obviously, a large amount of my experience has been, running a software company, and so, we started working with agile methodologies probably more than 10 years ago, and so, for me to say, well, what happens outside the dev team is what happens in the rest of the business, which inevitably is reasonably small. So, a small degree, but I suppose, where I would, I'd point to, obvious areas that no one's mentioned yet, and so without wanting to steal anyone else's thunder, I see marketing as being an area of any business that I think is highly amenable to taking on board agile principles, where instead of doing big campaigns, you break campaigns down into much smaller iterable units that can iterate on themselves much more quickly. So that's one thing that I would point to. And I'll pass on at that stage, I think, to because, as I say, my experience is deeply within this kind of software focus.
Okay, so from my perspective, I work for Pharmaceutical Press, and we're essentially a drug information provider. So we publish databases of drug information. So historically, that's been in print. So producing large, multi-volume works in some cases every 3 years, if you go back far enough. And obviously with the birth of the internet and the desire to have information more rapidly, particularly around drug information more rapidly to pharmacists and into the NHS and people, users. What we've seen within our editorial teams is a concept of an editorial sprint. So they're starting to use, or they've been using actually for 2 or 3 years now, a 2-week iteration. It's really being driven by the desire to have smaller pieces of content updated. So from their perspective, slightly different model from the journal article. We don't have new content coming through all the time. It's about iterating on the same content and just updating the database. So what they've done is really focused around trying to break that down and understand how they can get smaller chunks of data. Historically, they started doing chapters, but to update a whole chapter, some of these books is also taking them 2 or 3 months worth of work. So they're starting to break it down then into smaller particles of content within that, whether that be monographs, whether it be POTS as we call them within that, which is about certain interactions or adverse reactions within the drugs and stuff. So it's a way of editorial teams enabling them to do smaller bits of content more quickly. But they're running in a fairly traditional, for want of a better term, agile way. They have a 2-week sprint, so they set themselves a commitment about how much content they're going to update in a 2-week iteration, and then they all go away and do that to a certain extent, and they've found that they've been much more collaborative as well in doing that, rather than historically the editors sort of going off and spending, if they're not careful, 3 months on their own researching and understanding what the change is. They're finding in those 2 weeks they're working much more collaboratively and working much more together about making sure that as a group they hit that commitment as well. So I think that's the other benefit that they have said to me they've seen is not just the ability to create smaller or update content quicker, but it's also the collaboration that's driven as well, which obviously is one of the key cornerstones of what we hope Agile is about. It's about sort of the interaction as much as the collaboration rather than the contract, for want of a better term. So that's something we've certainly seen.
I mean, what you've just said there, Jeremy, is really interesting to me because, the risk of reminiscing, I remember we worked in an organisation both together probably 20-something years ago where, reference works were produced on a 10-year iterative cycle. It sounds as though there's a kind of almost a sea change in terms of culture there, and to break down the kind of the mentality that says we need to consider the entirety of everything before we can even, change a small piece, to now be able to say, no, independently we can change small pieces on their own without affecting the integrity of the whole. I mean, is that a cultural change?
I think, for my sector, I think it is driven by cultural change. I think it's driven probably out of the technology teams and the adoption of Agile there and the understanding you want to work in much smaller iterations. The interesting bit is, though, that, it's a bit like building any software solution or any system that we're all used to. You still get things like cross-references and stuff. So that's something they're very wary of, is you change a bit of information about the interaction of one drug with another. It does have impacts onto other, because as we all know, as people talk about cocktails of drugs that hopefully no one here is taking, but there's that interaction, understanding if one drug changes, it does have interaction. So you've got to be wary of that. So it's not quite being blinkered about, I can just change this bit of information, it doesn't matter. But as long as they're cognizant of that, then yes, I think there is a sea change. And that to me is moving away from the traditional multi-volume, as you say, Richard. We were producing, I think, like 24-volume multi-reference works. These are a bit smaller than that, but even so, there's still 2 or 3 volumes in print.
That's almost back to the supply side, demand side that
Yep.
Max was talking about this morning. We have a very similar publication to the ones that Jeremy's working on. We're doing exactly the same thing as Jeremy is about getting people to update a single line or a single dosage in a very long monograph of text. And one of the things we've seen is that, trying to use those techniques, getting people to work collaboratively together, but it can also be used as a reason not to change. So you can't possibly, it's not clinically safe to do that. So actually understanding the culture and the framework in which your editorial teams work, what drives them, what doesn't drive them, has been a real challenge for our editorial teams going through that process of getting people to say, I need to change this because in order to be competitive, we have to continually update. And it's who is fastest to market with that update is actually now a big part of, rather than just you've got every drug in there, it's actually who can tell you what difference there is tomorrow rather than next month.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a change in the marketing team too, in that because we're able to deliver software in smaller chunks, we're starting talking about it a lot more earlier in the process. So, a couple of years ago, we wouldn't have been able to have Daniel up here on a panel like we did this morning because we'd have to wait until he got near the end of the project. But some of the stuff he's working on could take years. So now we're able to talk about things a lot earlier in smaller chunks and invite collaboration, and that's been paying off a lot in that we've able to collaborate more with people that we never would have done before this early on.
So we've spoken quite a bit about this sort of almost minimum publishable unit in the context of major reference works. And Peter Armstrong several years ago said that a book is a startup and talked about his lean publishing model. So thinking not so much about the large major reference works that already exist, but about new work, whether that's data or anything else. What do you see as the future for this sort of minimum publishable unit?
I think from our perspective, we have a drug information platform, and what we're trying to do is add new product to that. So alongside existing products that we're maintaining and iterating on, absolutely trying to create new ones. And it is very much about trying to develop those in an agile way in terms of understanding, it's not about, again, historically a printed product and therefore you need to get the whole thing done. It's about being able to build up information. So we are looking to release products. I mean, it's a bit like a journal type model where as long as you've got, when I worked at Nature, as long as you had about 10 articles, then you could probably release a new journal, basically, was the attitude. And then you can roll on from there. So we're trying to do a similar sort of model in information products activity. You don't need the whole data set in order to be able to go live with something. I mean, obviously, you appreciate it's got to be good enough to be able to take to market and valuable enough that people will get, understand what it is and therefore what it will be. But it's about trying to show enough that you can then build upon that, but actually start releasing it early.
I would say, I think one of the interesting things for all of us in this room is the minimal kind of marketable or publishable product is who's got what. Do you now as a publisher need to have all of those different components in order to be able to sell something, or can you, if you can componentize your offer enough, can you then pull in the other units that you need that a customer is prepared to pay for? Because as publishers, none of us, unless you're very, very large, and certainly at our scale, we don't have the volume. We don't have all of the answers to give a complete, comprehensive review to meet a user's specific need at that point in time. And they may not want a whole journal. So how does it work when they only want one article every 6 months, or they want to read one thing, they want to take one small topic because they happen to see a patient with a very rare condition in front of them that day, and that's the only thing they want. But how do you package that up and sell that isn't just through the kind of the mechanisms we have now around pay-per-view? So what are those new models that are going to come through that allow somebody to get what they need to solve a problem that they have there at that point? And how does your brand and reputation as a publisher for delivering that information need they have mean they come back to you again and again the next time they've got that informational need?
Yeah, so for our readership, we're trying to engage people and keep them on the site longer, to use our research more prominently and then submit to us too. One of the things we're looking at is computational reproducibility inside the journal. So having things like Jupyter notebooks containing Python scripts and our markdown statistics files, and and having those submitted to us for peer review and then have them published as the article. And by that point, people can then come in, and if all they care about is getting some decent data that's been peer reviewed on a particular subject, they can come in and just take that small part and not worry about the rest of the article. We'll give them separate DOIs and so on. So we're investigating how that might perpetuate for people to come to the site just to get that data and interact with it in that space, rather than the traditional way, which is find an article, read the whole article, and then go off and find where the data is, and try and keep everything together.
So at the risk of ruining the happy party, and I'm not going to ruin the happy party, but I guess one thing I would say is that I just go back to that kind of what we were talking about a moment ago, which is this kind of cultural change issue. Really, I think that there's the idea that you can move from an investment model, if you like, which says we build products by essentially incurring a fairly large fixed cost, which we then monetize happily afterwards, which is kind of very, very sort of traditional way of looking at how a lot of published products work, not just kind of in obviously that works very well in sort of book, in the kind of reference and books side, but the point I'm making anyway is that the idea of iteration is fundamentally predicated on the idea that you continue to invest, and I think that that's something where in my experience of having delivered the kind of technology side through agile projects, it requires a very significant amount of understanding and buy-in at all levels in an organisation to work really, really effectively. And I think that that's something which, and I probably will just keep coming, sort of that point to me is so fundamental. None of this can work unless you're prepared to really look at a very different model of product creation and sustaining products over a different kind of investment life cycle. So, and like I say, I think things can succeed or fail on that basis. Absolutely.
So, I mean, that was a very good point. You do need a level of buy-in throughout the organisation to really make agile work, even within a technology team. We talked a little earlier about, areas of the business that have gone lean, whether by name or not. And you mentioned marketing as a good example, as well as editorial, and obviously editorial on your side as well. How would you, as a technology leader, advise non-technology teams to get that kind of buy-in? Sorry, I know that wasn't one of our pre-prepared questions.
I mean, how to get? I think that's a difficult one, really, isn't it? Because I guess I'm saying that has to come from high up. I think you need to have, and if it's not, then you're going to find yourself in the position where you may be being asked to come up with product, but you just don't have the structure in place, and so I think that has to start somewhere from a strategic level. And I think if you have a strategy that points you in that direction, then it's a question of the organisation has to come to terms with that broadly. It's not just a kind of product development thing. It's not just a technology thing. It's not just if you try and silo the approach to broadly to kind of taking on board these lean ideas into one part of the business. That's almost anathema. It needs to run across all the functions of the business. So what would I don't know? It sounds as like that's the piece of advice that I can't give. It's something that it needs to be supported by the strategy at the highest level.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think what I would say I've seen in some ways is that we talked earlier about the growth of sort of product managers, and if I go back 10 years, I don't think there were product managers that didn't exist. Publishers, essentially, in the publishing house, I was responsible for their P&L, for their product, and what we've seen, I think, is without a doubt the growth of the product manager, and with that an understanding, I think, and that helps culturally. People understand this is a live product and it needs continual feeding and development. So I think that helps us in terms of the technology never stands still, and people appreciate and understand that. I think people also understand now, or starting to understand that products, particularly digital products, also need that continuous redevelopment and reinvestment that you're talking about, Richard. So I think certainly where I am at the moment, I feel that there is an understanding of that. That the products aren't static. We can't just create them and let them run, and you know, there'll be a cash cow for the next 10 years, hopefully, or whatever it might be. That there is a constant growth, and that is driven, I think, part by having, you know, an understanding and a good product management function that then brings those groups together. So as much of the technology in terms of maybe some of the process, about how to iterate on stuff, how to be collaborative in our working, often to me it's about a good, strong product management function can bring the different groups together. Because that's right, you know, technology and editorial still struggle to talk to each other on occasions. The language I experience does, you know, we miss each other occasionally. And hopefully you get a good product manager, they sit in the middle and do a bit of translation.
We've got, you know, I might be making huge assumptions here, but we've got, you know, eLife, which is, as far as I can see, born in that way. You're born into a mentality that already takes that on board. And then we have two, you know, much more, you know, long-lived publishing organisations that are, you know, Sharon, I mean, how does your organisation move towards this kind of bigger adoption of lean across the, you know, across all the different business functions?
I suppose, I mean, if I joined BMJ 5 years ago, and we didn't do Agile at all when I joined. So if I just talk through very briefly, some of it's about just being belligerent and pushing it through. Some of my colleagues in the room may have seen this or not, but I think one of the things was I had absolute buy-in from the chief exec, who started at the same time I did, and we both knew there were areas of the business that we needed to transform the way in which we created and managed those products. So that was part of it. Some of it was changing what I could change, so I changed the way the technology team worked because I could do that, and that forced product management to change around it. We were still kind of delivering, and I don't think the relationship between technology and editorial worked at all when I got there. I mean, literally we worked behind a closed door, and requirements came in and out underneath the door, and they would not talk to each other at all. And now, you will always find an editor sitting somewhere in technology, or a technologist sitting somewhere in editorial. Those barriers have gone, even though they're on different floors. We tried to find a language that everyone could understand. We tried to find a way, and it took us a long time to think about how you paid for sprints. So we actually now have a cost per sprint, and everyone budgets for business as usual sprints. So every year people are budgeting to change their product every year. And then they have investment sprints where they want to do something new to the product. And that for us fits in with our culture and our way of handling things financially. And those sprint costs are made up of the cost of employing that team. So the danger and the worry always is that if nobody wants any sprints, then I've got a team that are going to sit there doing nothing and a very large cost on the balance sheet that we haven't hit that yet. I don't know whether we will, but trying to get people to understand the value of what they ask for. So when you run a tech team people can say, can I have that bell and that whistle on that product? They have no idea how much it costs to deliver. We suddenly had a lot less functionality requests coming through when they realised it was going to cost them several £1,000s to create that. So that's been one of the ways we have made that work through. And I would say, now we have a very strong product management culture. We've brought in something called pragmatic marketing framework, which helps us really focus on it's got to be a market problem that is persistent and somebody is prepared to pay for it. And we don't start building anything unless we can answer, and there are at least 2 product managers in the room today who are working to that all the time. That's front and centre for them. And I think, just in a very short time frame, that language has changed quite significantly. But it's been driven a lot from the leadership across the whole company at the top. And that's helped. So for me, it's trying to find what is the culture in your organisation, what is the language they speak, and trying to use that and try and build parallels, or use that as a framework for trying to get what you want done underneath it.
So
the language is important. I've certainly been in places where people are trying to introduce lean and they've come in speaking Japanese terms and all this sort of thing, where actually you just need to show people the improvements. So so you're right about eLife being born sort of in experimentation in minds. It's run by scientists for scientists, but there's still plenty to be improved. And when I joined, the one thing that struck me was that things were quite invisible. And so one of the first things that I tried to introduce was to make things more visible. They'd just been working on a dashboard. So I made all our stats visible. People were starting to measure things, and they're all now making those more visible too. Because as soon as you've got those metrics and you're measuring the right thing and things are more visible, you can people see for themselves what they can improve. And as things do change, you can see those needles moving in the right or the wrong direction. One of the other things that I always give advice to people trying to get these things in place is to start having regular retrospectives where you look back over the last 2 weeks or month or whatever, and look at ways that you can improve, and have a very sort of blameless sit down with your team and try and find ways that you can improve, because it's like wishing for more wishes, really. You basically can constantly keep bringing things up there that you can then improve, and that's how you can influence things that are going on. So a few teams at eLife now look back at what we're doing. We did a whole company retrospective after our big launch this year too, to see how we don't behave like that again, and out of that there's been some really remarkable and good improvements that we've made.
So, last prepared question from me, and obviously those of you who are on the sharp end of publishing, by which I mean the people who get stuff done in operations, I'm sure you will all agree that our back-end workflow tools, peer review, production and so forth, are far from ideal when you think about an agile world. They aren't agile. They're possibly better than paper, but that's debatable. Where development teams have lovely tools like Jira Kanban that make your next task really instantly visible and very easy to do. You were talking about lots of data.
Yeah.
Where should we look?
So it's interesting you say that Jira is a lovely tool, because I find it like a cesspit of knowledge.
Try Editorial Manager or
yeah,
Scholar One or any of them. They're all as bad as each other.
I've also seen many vendors and products too. So what I like to see is people writing sticky notes on a wall, and I got a tour of Sharon's office recently, and they covered in it. It's the same at eLife, and I imagine many other places too. So having things that are really tangible to see, that you can easily adapt. So you've got 4 columns one day, you need 3. If you're doing that in Jira, it's going to take you 5 minutes to figure out where the thing is. The other thing you can do is just wipe the thing off a board, and you've got 3 columns. So just keeping it low tech and visible, so that people know what's going on. And then working with the tools themselves, you kind of have to think of the process that they're trying to emulate, and then change it to that. We struggled when we used Highwire to emulate the process we wanted. With our current vendor for submission and peer review, it costs a change, and there's very specific things in there just for us, just so they can fit in what we're doing. So the thing that we're doing at the moment is building all this infrastructure ourselves. So we've got Continuum, which does the publication and hosting side, and now we're collaborating with Coco to build a submission and peer review platform too. And although we want to be able to have this user-driven setup for this whole software that we want to run ourselves, one of the main drivers for it is that we can innovate and we can iterate and we can easily adapt it a lot more than we can with a vendor. And that's kind of how we want to operate, so that we can keep experimenting as we have done since we began.
So we've done similar things in terms of we're building what we call a PCC, Publishing Control Center. So we're building that ourselves, so that enables us to run nightly builds of our content out of our databases, so we can do nightly exports and then push them onto QA servers or QA versions of the site for people to check, and then for the editorial to manage the workflow. So the intent of them is to enable the workflows to be managed entirely outside of sort of production and technology, for example. So they're managed by the editorial teams, so they can write content, see a nightly build, and then change it. But in truth, we're sort of following a similar model in terms of having to build that ourselves, and we're in the process of doing that. We have a sort of fledgling version now, and we're hoping to iterate and build on that, rather than finding a tool out there that is going to do what we want. I'm aware that we've not got journal workflows, so there aren't really any products out there that are suitable for what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So we sort of, in some ways, almost had no choice but to create something that's bespoke. But that also comes with some challenges as well. I mean, you end up building something that if you're not careful, it does what the workflow is, right? And you can back yourself into a corner if you then find you want to change that, and the tooling then dictates the process, which is a bit what you're saying all around Jira and stuff. Yeah, that's what Jira locks you into. Yeah, it locks you into workflows, and you spin up another project in Jira, and it doesn't quite do the same workflow as the other one, and it all gets a little bit messy. So there's no simple solution to that. The way we're tackling it is to build our own, but that comes with some level of cost and risk.
Well, the only thing I have to say, Tasha, is you were telling me earlier that so maybe disclose to the whole audience maybe that this. Is there anything interesting for you to tell us there about the work that you've been doing?
Sadly not. I have been running a trial using Jira Kanban for one of our small journals. It is working a hell of a lot better than our traditional peer review system. We've knocked about 20 days off the time through peer review, purely by changing the system, not by changing the workflow, but it has definitely facilitated changing the workflow as well. Because, yes, okay, it takes 5 minutes in Jira to figure out how to do it, but it takes 6 months to get our supplier to change workflows for us. So, yes, there is some experimentation going on, but it's certainly not happening at scale.
We use Jira in the tech team. We use Trello a lot in the rest of the organisation. That seems to be one of the most popular boards that I've seen coming through, but they've tried lots of different things, and I would say that it's different for each product, and each product has a different group of people and a different set of needs of its workflow. So our journals business is very different to our businesses where we create and manage content internally, where we're writing content and we've got lots of flows. We work in Google Docs. A lot of our editorial content is created in Google, flows backwards and forwards. That's quite, you actually need a lot of workflow because you can see who's working on it, and everyone's working on it at the same time, which is, we actually broke Google Docs' number of different colours they could have for track changes because we had so many people adding stuff to it that we asked them for more colours and they couldn't give us any more than they had. So I think it's about trying to let people experiment with free tools. These things don't cost anything or not very much money, and just letting people try and work out what problem they're trying to solve. But we have some of those very big sort of industry standard solutions, and we're looking to try and replace those. We're looking at a couple of solutions. We looked at one last week that the Washington Post are using. So looking outside of our kind of core industry and trying to think, what is it we are managing? What is it we're trying to push through? And a lot of the US newspapers have been doing some really interesting things with technology. So looking over there to see what they're up to. But we also use Excel spreadsheets, and as Paul said, we have a lot of sticky notes, and our main exec prioritisation process, which our leadership team manages, is on a whiteboard on wheels with index cards on, and that is videoed every fortnight at our executive meeting, and that's the main communication tool of all workflow at the highest level in the company.
It's interesting. We often called upon to talk about open science and open data sharing within communities of scientists, and we just say, well, just look out to tools that you use in the rest of your life. Google Drive is a classic example, and Trello too. That they're free, easy to use. So try those out. If it doesn't work, the most you've lost is a few days trying it.
Or you've built a prototype of what you actually do want. And I think that's what you don't want. You don't necessarily know exactly what you do want.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you to the panel. I'm going to throw it open to the floor. So, question at the back. Just shout.
I agree the whole notion of the low-tech thing, good post-it note and the white thing is pretty good stuff. The question is, how do you then translate that to the kind of dashboards everybody really likes to see?
So, although I don't particularly like Jira, we do use it. And the main thing I do like about it is that I get a pretty dashboard like the one I showed at the beginning of the first slide. So,
square the circle.
Exactly. So, before I worked at eLife, our teams used to manage 8 different teams, and they used to draw those graphs on their whiteboards, and that was enough. We used to do a tour of the boards once a week, and we'd see those nice graphs and the same trends. So you don't necessarily need a software tool to draw those graphs, but because the team like using Jira, then I just utilise that fact.
I think it's really understanding who needs to actually see those graphs and what are they going to do with them. So we try very hard not to produce any of them unless we have to. Because just producing reports for the sake of it is work we don't need to do. And I don't think at the moment anyone's worried about measuring the number of story points on a weekly basis. The team are very fast. They move through this stuff. We could if we wanted to, but we actually choose not to. So we can leave a lot of stuff on paper cards for that reason.
And I would echo that. Actually, we don't tend to do publish metrics like that. We tend to avoid that and focus really on what we've actually delivered. So it's just trying to, demo what we've delivered every 2 weeks, which we do, and get the conversation around that rather than about, as you say, story points and stuff. I think we've moved away from that, interesting enough. A couple of years ago we were doing that, and we've sort of, realised that actually they were just numbers in the air that weren't really driving what we're actually doing. What we're delivering is what we're doing.
Yeah, good working code
Yes.
and product out of the door making money. Is, and I think one of the things we've tried to do is to get our dev teams to understand that that's what they're doing. So every story point they complete is money in the door, and actually tying those things together is because otherwise you can become very isolated from it.
Yeah, I mean the metrics that we have on our dashboards are for the team themselves, and the time when we pour over them the most are in our retrospective to find out why suddenly did the cycle time go up 4 days this week? Oh, it's because X, Y, Z happened, or someone was off or whatever. So we certainly don't send it out as a reported document to the rest of the team, although they're welcome to look.
Any more? Okay, in which case, thank you very much to the panellists, and thank you all for listening.